So welcome,
Thank you.
brave people who braved the fire emergency to come to Orthogonality and RPGs. I am going to mispronounce Orthogonality at least 10 times. Lots of syllables. We're going to start with who we are. I made the presentation, so I'm going to do who am I, but these guys are really important too, so they're going to introduce themselves. My name is Patrick Holloman. I'm the founder of the Game Design Forum, which is a website that studies game design. I'm also the author of the Reverse Design series, which is a series of 6 books, which looked at various classics of video game design, and I wrote book-length essays, sort of deconstructing literally everything in them. The two that are relevant are Final Fantasy VII and Diablo 2, which will appear at the end of this presentation. So those are my credentials and what I do. I'll let these guys go.
You want me? Okay. My name is Daniel Greenberg. I'm an adjunct professor of computer game design at George Mason University. My thesis work was in transmediation of games and opera, titled Brava Celis, narrative elements in Final Fantasy VI and late period Italian opera. I am also the founder of Winter Ion Game Studios, based out of the historic video gaming district of Clifton, Virginia. We produce Ion Gaming on YouTube.
My name's Luke Peterschmidt. I'm an alcoholic and I want to be a cowboy. No, sorry. My name's Luke Peterschmidt. I come from the tabletop game space. Been doing it for about 20-something years as a game designer, as a brand manager, as an executive, as a CEO, as a company owner. I currently, Bakugan, anyone know what that is? I was the game designer for Bakugan. So my role-playing connections are thinner than this group, so I'm probably going to listen more than talk, but I will have opinions.
His humility means he's going to dazzle us all with some incredible story of how he met Dave Arneson at Gen Con one year or something like that.
No, but I do own Dave Arneson's Redbox game. Long story, I'll tell it at the end. It's funny.
See, this is what I'm talking about. He signed on for the credibility factor, and boy, does he have it. So this is my warning about myself. I write books about video game design, but I also really enjoy enormously pretentious comparisons, especially between forms of media. So I'm going to lead off with one of those, just to show what I mean by when I say orthogonality, which I still maintain I'm going to mispronounce at least 5 times. Oop. Sorry, unfamiliar with this version of PowerPoint. So this is a poem by the American poet Trumbull Stickney. It's kind of small on the screen, I know. I'm going to read it to you. It's like I think it might be a sonnet, but it's kind of a bad one. Trumbull Stickney was a turn-of-the-century poet around the 20th century, came out of Harvard. He's a good poet, but this is a bad poem, and I chose a bad poem on purpose because we're going to compare it to a good poem, which we're then going to compare to RPGs. Like I said, massively pretentious, and I'm aware of that. The poem reads, "Be still, the hanging gardens were a dream that over Persian roses flew to kiss the curled lashes of Semiramis. Troy never was, nor green Scamander stream. Provence and Troubadour are merest lies. The glorious hair of Venice was a beam made within Titian's eye. The sunsets seem, the world is old, very old and nothing is. Be still, thou foolish thing, thou canst not wake, nor thy tears wedge thy solder lids apart. But patter in the darkness of thy heart, thy brain is plagued, thou art a frighted owl. Blind with the light of life thou'st not forsake, and error loves and nourishes thy soul." So, bad poem. Mostly for this reason, is that there's only 2 sections they do one thing. They just make lists. Now, certain poets can carry off a list. Walt Whitman can make a really majestic list, which is incredible. He did that a number of times. But here, really, this poem breaks down into 2 problems. The first is a list of famous places, and the second is a list of foolish characteristics. And if you notice, those lists don't amount to anything. Like, each image in the famous places doesn't modify any of the other images. They just a list. They don't add up to anything. There's one kind of interesting line right here that talks about the subjectivity of the artist, but it doesn't go anywhere. So we're going to get to what this means for orthogonality in a sec. This is a better poem by a slightly more famous poet, Robert Frost. It's called Acquainted with the Night. I'll read it off because, again, it's really short. "I have been one acquainted with the night. I have walked out in rain and back in rain. I have outwalked the furthest city light. I have looked down the saddest city lane. I have passed by the watchman on his beat and dropped my eyes, unwilling to explain. I have stood still and stopped the sound of feet when far away an interrupted cry came over houses from another street, but not to call me back or say goodbye. And further still, at an unearthly height, one luminary clock against the sky proclaimed the time was neither wrong nor right. I have been one acquainted with the night." Now, better poem, better language. It doesn't try to be a romantic poem when it's a 20th century poem, which is always a good idea. And the images are a little more crisp. But what I'm really looking at is this line right here. And this is going to show us something about orthogonality in art. The line is, as he passes the cup, he says, I have dropped my eyes, unwilling to explain. Now, the rest of the poem, like Stickney's, is basically a list of things that are sad, right? I'm really sad, I'm walking out in the rain. There's a Cowboy Bebop song about that, right? We've all heard that one. Same idea, right? There's nothing new under the sun. But the interesting thing here is that Frost, when he passes the cup, he doesn't say he's unable to explain. I'm so depressed, I can't even. That's Kylo Ren. That's not Robert Frost. He says he's unwilling to explain. And unwilling is not depression, it's petulance, which can be, the same. You can have that at the same time. You can be petulant or depressed or both. But in this case, the petulance suggests that he is also, it just suggests, it doesn't confirm, but it suggests that maybe this character is the source of his own problems. It just gives us a clearer picture of this character because he's not just depressed. He's not an avatar of depression. There's other characteristics to him. And just that one word really sort of speaks volumes because it is, in a sense, orthogonal to depression. It comes at it from a totally different angle. So that's why these poems are on screen. That's why the massively pretentious comparison. The official definition of orthogonal, and then you want to jump in. The official definition of orthogonal, according to OED, is something that exists at right angles to something else or statistically independent. And for my purposes, I'm going to say it's a game design element which modifies some other element, but not by directly increasing or decreasing it. So it's not just the same idea more or less. It's something that comes at something else sideways.
Yeah, sure. So the easiest way to think about this is not necessarily an analogy, but just kind of to take it from a forward-facing perspective, and that is normally we approach a problem and there's some sort of evident solution or an idea that for every door a key. But there are many times when certain scenarios play out, be it in the tabletop space, the video game space, where some level of creative thinking or some element of design or something that's been conveyed to you subtly or not necessarily directly is a viable solution or sometimes even an optimum solution. And it can be an exciting thing from a design perspective as a game developer to try to see into the player's mind, into that space. How can you convey to a player that there are these opportunities? How can a system be designed to present or make available those opportunities for something other than direct competition as a determined variable? Okay. So like strength.
He summarized the whole presentation. You'll go home.
Well, so like, well, what? Just sports, strength comparison, higher number, better score wins, lower score. That is always an option, generally speaking, but sometimes it isn't, and sometimes it isn't the best one. And it's a matter of giving a space from a design perspective where you make those kind of lateral decision-making options available.
Do you think they need to be codified in the rules? Because the classic example I'm thinking of from your description is Hearts. Hearts has a strategy that you try to do, and Hearts you try to not win any hearts. Or
you can shoot for the moon.
You try to win all the hearts.
Yeah.
Right, but that's codified in the rules,
right,
as opposed to sometimes these things are player exploits or player derivatives.
That's a really good question. I totally didn't think about that. So
it can be both, right? So obviously you can make a game which is designed, and you have some examples, so I won't spoil them, but going forward, of games that are intentionally designed to provide multiple avenues, multiple pathways of success. Some met with success, some met with failure. There's examples of both. But then there are games more in the tabletop space, which I'm sure you could speak to, where games are open enough that players who are capable of coming up with that creativity can inspire, say, the person running the game, like, yes, you're right, that's a really clever thing I didn't think of, I'm going to let that work.
Awesome. All right. So this is just like my totally generic example of orthogonal helms. The helm of protection, I made this up, but it's pretty close to the original templates from D&D. Offers you defense rating +1 or -1 if you're playing AD&D first edition, because that didn't make any sense. So it quantitatively modifies your defense rating. It makes you less likely to get hit because your numbers are better. Whereas the helm of camouflage basically says beast-type enemies will not aggro while you wear this helm. This is obviously a homebrew item, but it means that enemies don't even notice you. So they have the same goal, right, is to avoid being hit. But the second helm avoids being hit not by modifying your defense stat, but by making enemies not notice you. So same goal, different avenues. One of the things, and I repeat this often for if you've ever been to one of my talks, but one of the great things about the history of RPGs, which this talk largely deals with, is that they have a clear beginning point in Dungeons and Dragons, the mother of all RPGs. No other field of study is quite so neat in that way. But interestingly enough, the RPG didn't come from nowhere. It came from tabletop strategy games, or war games, as Arneson and Gygax would have called them. And there are a lot of examples that many of you will be familiar with. The game that immediately preceded, or the two games that immediately precede Dungeons & Dragons are Chainmail and Blackmoor. But before those, there was a little lesser known, not little known, but lesser known game called Braunstein, which I'm also going to mispronounce because I can't speak German. Really ruins my tabletop credentials that I can't speak German. But the Braunstein is the game actually pictured here. You can actually see Dave Wesley on the left, and Dave Arneson's dead in the middle. He's sort of bending over on the sort of the background there, reaching out. Braunstein is the place in the history of tabletop and RPG games where orthogonality really became an important part, a pillar of the RPG, if you will. Braunstein basically works like this. There's two generals, just like any other strategy game. There's two generals on a battlefield trying to win over control of Braunstein. That's like every other strategy game that's basically ever existed. Well, not Catan, I know. Don't get into it. Anyway, so the two war game, the war game format means two generals square off and they're going to fight for control or military victory over an area of ground. Sometimes in a war game, the tactical considerations are different for each side. Sometimes there's like the one side wants to retreat successfully and the other side wants to win, and so the victory conditions are different. But it's always two strategoi duking it out on a battlefield. Braunstein changed that. Braunstein introduced the idea that there could be other roles, such as the chancellor of the University of Braunstein, the mayor of the town, the chief of police, the leader of the student union. And all of those people wanted things which were orthogonal to the military victory. Now, those goals were made up on the spot, and then the sort of victory conditions for each person were different. But they were not strategoi trying to win a military victory. They had different goals. That is the point in history, which I think is really wonderful that there is one, where orthogonality enters the RPG. Essentially what had happened was orthogonal roles had entered the tabletop format, which were one of three pillars of the RPG. I'm not going to go into the other two pillars, but they were simulated skills and level ups. Those are the three ideas which make an RPG an RPG. But I want to take a look real quick at what orthogonal roles look like, and many of you will recognize these archetypes here. So based on the war game prototype, all RPGs everyone had a combat role, right? You put a unit on the battlefield, it's there to kill things. But each of these roles also had an orthogonal component, which is the ranger on the left there. He likes to shoot things at a distance, but he also has nature-based skills like foraging, building, foraging, hunting, tracking people via their footsteps in the dirt, building shelters in the wilderness. He has things which are not killer skills, but which are nevertheless useful. The wizard casts fireballs, which is really cool. But he also has item identification, teleportation, other arcane arts which are very useful to things like item crafting and transportation. And those are great, and those are totally orthogonal to his combat abilities. The rogue he gets behind the enemies and stabs them in the back. But he also can pick locks, and he can also pick pockets and disarm traps and find things. Those are his skills that are orthogonal to his combat abilities. And then the paladin or warrior likes to get up close and hit things in the face with a hammer. But he also persuades people and has charisma and is a party leader and offers all kinds of other orthogonal benefits.
And I'm sure you're going to have something to speak on this moment, but I want to just stress, not only was it thematically designed in there, and not only did the rules provide the opportunity for these different roles to do different things, the very mechanics by which these different classes played were very distinct. You had one person who was essentially working on a linear scale going up and down and dealing with THAC0 and armor class and how that entire mathematical system broke down. You had someone else who was going through big arcane things and dealing with spell slots and sort of like big arrays of data. You had another person who was playing a percentile game because all the skills worked on percentages and success or failure was dependent on those. So even the mechanics, the underlying stuff that built those early D&D versions were functionally different, thematically different, and purpose-driven different. So there was such a distinct difference between them that there was no real way to feel like any two people were necessarily playing the same way. They just had common aim.
Yeah, one of the challenges of looking at any role-playing game from a mechanical standpoint is when you analyze games, you usually look at how do you win. And because D&D role-playing games generally aren't ortho games that and then a ranking of players, things get very different. But what is encouraged in D&D early on, when you're a young player particularly, is gaining experience points and leveling up. It's a goal. And the odd part about early D&D, for all its orthogonality in moving the story forward and solving things, rarely gave experience points for doing those things successfully. It just wasn't in a lot of the early stuff. Like, you get experience points for killing things. Monsters had listed experience points for what you get. Picking a pocket, the reward was, well, you got some money, and that might help you buy some things, and that might help you kill something.
It's an orthogonal reward.
Yeah, it's an orthogonal reward, exactly. But it's interesting, if you go into D&D thinking my objective is experience points, it gets a little odd. That's why now DMs are so happy to give experience points for things like role-playing.
Right. And
you played the game well. You did a sacrifice for your character.
You showed up to a game night on time.
And that's
Amen.
been an interesting thing to watch, because D&D
Yeah.
as a game has had periods where it's experimented with the levels of the discrepancy and difference. I maintain if they had released 4th edition under a name other than Dungeons & Dragons and pitched it as it's a new game that's meant to simulate MMOs, which is why everyone works on these same sort of mechanical constructs of at-wills, encounters, dailies, but they're still all trying to solve different problems. The problem was D&D had built this expectation of such specialization on a class level that when they kind of normalized all the combat systems and normalized a lot of those things, I think it threw a lot of people for a loop. And I think part of the reason 5th Ed is blowing up is not just because Twitch has made it such an interesting thing to share with people in a way that we really couldn't prior to the advent of all the streaming media, but also because it's trying to revive sort of that sense of different people problem solving in different ways and approaching things, you know, with that linear pattern.
So then the question becomes, how does orthogonality affect the history of video game design or tabletop game design, or specifically RPG design, which is mainly what we're going to be investigating here. So, and the answer is that orthogonality can be done well and it can be done poorly. This is a strip from Penny Arcade detailing one of the author's experience with Deus Ex: Human Revolution, in which he complains that he makes a hacker character who's really good at machines, and then that character gets forced into a room with a giant guy with a giant arm cannon, and he's totally screwed because he can read the guy's email, but that's about it. He's not suited for combat. And anyone who's played Dungeons and Dragons, especially like the early BioWare games, knows that there are lots of dead builds. But I think dead builds are a failure of the designer and not like a trap that the novice player has fallen into.
Can you define dead builds real quick for the audience?
A dead build is any build which cannot get through the entire game because there is a point in the game in which their skills cannot, by any means, orthogonal or orthodox, get through the content that is mandatorily placed in front of them. It's not really possible in a tabletop setting because the DM can bend rules. But in a video game, it becomes a choke point for a number of builds of characters that are creative but just not suited to what's there.
Yeah, and specifically for this example, this game was renowned for, especially the prior version of the series, Warren Spector's original Deus Ex, which is still lauded really to this day. The idea that you could go through any number of paths, an engineering build, a stealth build, a melee build, a combat build, whatever necessarily worked for you. But the problem is in the original remake here, Human Revolution, I always get the names of the first two, the most recent two they next. But anyway, you can kind of see this branching path outwards from the start of the game where you have all these opportunities, but the game had a series of boss fights. And the boss fights reconvened back at a singular choke point named combat. So for all of your non-combat builds, you were able to progress to a point. And the point was the third panel, which is the big angry guy with the arm cannon. And that pattern repeats itself a few times in the game. So the game kind of translates and encourages this idea of play it your way until your way is violently, painted against a wall because your way was not the correct way.
No, not that way.
Yeah.
Right.
And you mentioned about the difference between the tabletop where the DM can bend the rules. So an RPG computer game, I think you could say you can win. It's a one-player game, usually, that you can win. You get to the end. You beat the final boss. The D&D early box games, right? You won. You got to the end. It was great. You don't win face-to-face D&D. You might finish a scenario, you might finish a mission, but then you keep playing. It's a very different environment. It's one player versus multiplayer, seriously goal-driven to much more open story-driven.
You win if the DM stops being your friend because you're too good at it.
I'm proud to say that my group actually finished a 3-year-long campaign, and they successfully defeated the campaign villain at the very end. So,
It happened.
Yeah. Somehow, some way, we managed to run a 3-year campaign.
So I'm in a 3-year 5th edition. I'm like level 4. This is a video from Deus Ex. Hopefully it plays. He's detailing this exact thing. I don't know if we have speakers. Let me find out.
Here.
Didn't think of that until just now.
I'll try.
There's probably a soundboard back there that it's not on.
We're going to find out. I can skip this slide. It's just funny.
Should we karaoke it?
Okay. So basically what happens here is that JC is a hacker. He's a hacker build, and he hacked and spied and did a lot of cool stuff. And he knows a phrase that can blow Gunter Herman up. And he says, this is the punchline. He goes, sticks and stones. And then Gunter blows up. I am not a machine. The voice acting is terrible, so it's not like we're missing a whole lot. And then yeah.
And
he
there
goes
he goes.
kaboom. Gunter Herman blows up. So if you're a hacker character in this game and you find the guy with the big arm cannon, you could just blow him up with words, because that's every nerd's dream.
Words kill. Words kill.
The game that I spend the most time on in this presentation, though, is Fallout New Vegas. A little bit of background on Fallout New Vegas. After, was it Black Isle? Were they the original Fallout people?
No, Interplay.
Interplay, sorry. So after Interplay shut down, and Chris Avallone and his friends were still trying to finish Van Buren, they had a lot of unfinished material for a game, and they mostly put that into Fallout New Vegas. But there was a 15-year gap, or I guess 14-year gap, between the close of Interplay and the release of the Bethesda game, Fallout New Vegas. And during that time, they played Fallout New Vegas as a tabletop for about 14 years. So, of course, the artifact of that is that there's tons and tons of orthogonal solutions to problems, because they have all these DM notes that they could go back to. For example, if you can beat this guy up, and you can threaten him, and you can kill him and take the notes from his pocket. Or if you have a really high intelligence score, I'm going to move this out so my co-hosts can see.
Nice.
If you have a really high intelligence score.
Too far. You killed him.
Did I? Are we back? Okay, great. So anyway, if you're smart enough, you have a really high intelligence score, you can just decide to lie to him. And he'll tell you everything he knows. And so that's just like a stat-based thing. That's not even like you have a skill. It's just a stat. It's great. My favorite one is, well, not my favorite one, but a really good example is that when you try to enter the city of Vegas, you need to have a certain amount of money, because they say you broke people can't enter, which makes sense. But in Fallout, you're always spending money. It's not hard to earn, but you're always spending it because you're always running out of ammo, your weapons are breaking, or you see a new piece of power armor, you need some health packs or whatever. So when you get there, you really normally, if you're your first time runner, you don't have any money. And now you have to go grind 2,000 caps. Or if you have 80 science skill, you can just hack the robot and he lets you in, which is awesome. But the best example, this is just the best example, this makes me so happy. This is the last boss of the game, Legatlantius, if you play anything other than the Kaiser's Legion. You can talk Legatlantius out of the last boss fight 2 different ways. So he says, maybe you're willing to listen to reason, and then if you pass a series of increasingly difficult speech checks, you can actually, and while gaining XP, talk him completely out of it. And then Legatlantius says, oh, you're right. It is politically impossible to hold the NCR. I am not going to conquer it. I'm going home. Game over. And you get a ton of experience. You win. It's like there's an actual victory condition for doing that. But what really blows my mind is, this is not a great screenshot, but you can also talk him out of it using your barter skill. If you have a really high barter skill, you can convince him that it's not economically feasible to conquer the NCR, that everyone would starve and they'd have nothing. And Legatlantius goes, hey, that adds up. And he leaves. Right? Like, how incredible is that? I'm blown away. I never actually did that. I found that in an FAQ, but I think that's pretty incredible. But I don't know if you guys want to. This is a really good point if you want to talk about some of your favorite examples, because I'm going to get into the weeds here a little bit.
On the anti-grinding or the last example?
The last example.
Was it clear to the players that those were options when they met that character?
Well, that means one of 3 choices, so they do give you a speech option. And as soon as you pass the first speech, you select, I don't want to kill you yet. It'll say speech 75 or something on it there. So it'll say, yes, you have a speech option here.
So the reason I asked, I have a good friend who did scripts for a very open-worlded game. I can't remember the name of it, but the game remembered what you did, who you talked to, and it would produce new. And it was unbelievable amount of content. My friend Ed had it right, and so we got so tired one day that there was a dog in the room, and he said, "Okay, if it goes exactly like this, the dog's going to talk." No one ever saw it. This game was a huge game. It was a new Ubisoft game. So he was up in Canada doing something, and he had a tree of exploration, that in this history of this AAA $100 million budget game, no one ever saw, ever, because it wasn't clear to the players that there was even an option. Like, it's such a deep Easter egg. Anyway, so I always think, like, if you have an orthogonal solution that is so well hidden as to be not there, is it really a solution? Or is it just like a funny Easter egg that someone put in there?
Yeah, that's a good point.
Like, like did you ride for that? Or you're like, I'm going to win this game by this weird thing. And I have no opinion either way if it's right or wrong. It's just interesting.
And New Vegas, which you use as an example here, is very good at making it clear to the player from the get-go that there are multiple paths to do this. Because from the very earliest things that happen, like when the doc wakes you up and then you go outside and talk to people, one of the first things that happens is like you're trying to gather them together because, oh, well, these guys are going to come by and they're dealing with some guy who's there like hiding out from a gang. It's the Powder Gangers? He's hiding out from? I can't recall. Anyway, so this guy's hiding out in the town that you wake up in, and you can try to recruit other people to help you out. You can negotiate with them. If you have like a repair skill, you can fix the bartender's radio. There's a lot you can do in that immediate town that makes it obvious what skill checks are and what stat checks are. You take a special test to do your stats at the very beginning. There's no real question that you have options besides shooting your way out of problems, but the game also is very happy to offer you shoot your way out of problems if you want to. Because there's no ambiguity from the beginning, you start tackling these problems from direction A, B, or C, depending on how you want to play it, and the game progressively continues on with that, onward and onward, because as you go down these different quest chains, and whether you're going to help out a certain group on the Vegas Strip, whether you're going to help out the Yes Man, whether you're going to help out the House, whether you're going to work for the NCR or for Caesar's Legion or whoever else, in every one of these cases, those quest paths themselves have directions for socially based characters to go, directions for intelligence-based characters to go, skill-based characters, melee combat, range combat. Again, whatever path you take, there's some viable route to go. And because of that, I think it succeeds in making sure players... But it's not super orthogonal in the sense that once you've kind of decided what sort of player you are, that solution tends to be your solution, whether it's a social hammer, a weapon hammer, a skill hammer, whatever you've chosen for your particular build, unless you're going really wide, and the game tends to favor specialization over jack-all-trades type builds because you have to pump 6, 7, 8 stat points into 1 or 2 stats to be able to reach those certain thresholds. Like if you're 7 out of 8 intelligence, you don't get the intelligence answer. If you are like 60% in a bunch of skills, but not 70% in one of them, you won't necessarily be able to get out of a certain combat scenario. And you don't obviously know that going in, but it does mean that in a game that has all these potential routes, it tends to be more of exploring which particular route interests you and which type of gameplay interests you. But you tend not to be stepping outside of your individual character's comfort zone, whatever that individual build may be.
So, but those builds are all of the potential builds are still orthogonal to one another in that
Yes.
one of them does not build into the next. They are not sequential.
Right.
Yeah. It's a really good distinction, by the way.
Yeah.
So, the original title of this talk was a little bit different, so that explains the slide title. But I want to talk sort of in the last third about grinding and how orthogonal solutions to that are presented in Diablo 2 and Final Fantasy 7, which are games which we tend to think about as having a lot of grind, or certainly have a reputation for having a lot of grind. But even within those kinds of games, there is still nevertheless some orthogonal measures which are supposed to make those games more enjoyable for the players. So how many people played Diablo 3 before the expansion came out? All right, so there's a few. I'll explain to the rest of you. When Diablo 3 came out, there was a certain problem with it, was that the best thing you could do for your character was just to amass one stat, your core stat. So if you were a barbarian, you wanted to amass as much strength as possible, or if you were a demon hunter, as much dexterity or intelligence for a wizard. And that's all there really was to do. You got one good weapon, and then you just powered through that one stat. And Diablo 2 wasn't like this. So like if you think of that powering one stat up as much as possible, that's the anti-orthogonality. That's totally what you might call orthodox in a bad sense. But in Diablo 2, they offered you a much broader range of things that you could do. Now, Diablo 2 is an intensely grindy game. Experienced players of Diablo 2, how many people have played Diablo 2? Okay, cool. Yeah, we're all good red-blooded Americans. Diablo 2 is super grindy, and people who are veterans of it know that the real game begins after you kill the last boss on the hardest difficulty. That's where the majority of your time is going to be spent, which is endlessly killing the same monsters over and over again to level up and to gain the best items in the game, because they drop really infrequently. So you need to kill Bale, 1,000 times in order to get your runes to build your crafted rune word. Although when you build it, it's so powerful, it's ridiculous. You feel amazing. But it does make you question your life decisions.
So one orthogonal strategy in Diablo was you didn't have to actually go into the dungeon and fight monsters if you could manage the marketplace really well. There was a way for you could level up many levels outside of the dungeon, and that's where orthogonal became an exploit, right? Sometimes the orthogonal way to win is to break the game and do something you're not supposed to do. So Magic the Gathering was full of that. Collectible card games are about orthogonality.
More or less.
Yeah, but so there's difference between I think a purposefully designed feature and a whoops.
And there were also some sort of organic marketplace-based solutions to that as well, because obviously gold only went so far in Diablo. It really gave you chances at gambling, really. But Stones of Jordan, kind of became this secondary currency, this idea that this thing was of a sufficient value and you collect enough of them, you can exchange these for that, and you could, red paperclip, trade your way up to what you were, potentially trying to acquire.
Yeah, it's great. So this is just an example on screen here. This is one of the most famous, this is probably the most famous Diablo item that there is, Diablo 2 item. It's a crafted item called Enigma. And it's a really good example of orthogonality in an itemization. Typically in Diablo 2, items give you more power by increasing your skills, which this actually does, plus 2 to all skills. Or they give you more stats like health, HP, MP, strength, dexterity, etc. Enigma is famous for something else that it does. Right, the third itemized skill there is +1 to teleport. Teleport does exactly what you think it does. It allows you to teleport around the map. It's hugely helpful. But typically, only a sorceress can teleport because she's a magic user. But this item, anyone who crafts it can have teleport forever, as long as they wear the item. So it gives you a huge boost in mobility. If you think about the essential problem of grinding, and this will come up a few more times in the rest of the presentation, the essential problem of grinding is that you're killing things to make yourself more powerful so that you can kill things faster, right? There's that feedback loop of I gain more levels, I kill things faster, I gain more loot, and you try to snowball, although there are things built in to counteract that. But you're trying to snowball and you want killing power. But in this case, instead of giving you killing power, you get a different means to get to the same goal. In Diablo 2, it's better to just fight the bosses and unique monsters. So, and you need to skip the common monsters, of which there are swarms, to do that. And teleport helps you do that. You can just teleport past all the swarms of monsters, assassinate all the really big guys to get their sweet items, and then you can just skip all the content that's not likely to drop really good stuff. And this item allows you to do that. It's a totally orthogonal, movement-based solution to the grinding problem. A couple of others here. On the left, you have Iron Pelt. It's a different kind of orthogonal benefit. The defense rating in Diablo operates largely like the defense rating in Dungeons & Dragons, in that the more defense you have, the less likely you are to be hit. But Iron Pelt also offers an orthogonal means of defense. It says, if you wear this armor, when you do get hit, you will take less damage. You take 15 less damage, which is actually a lot in the first 2 difficulty settings. So it has 2 ways of defending you or saving your life. One is by avoiding hits, and the other is by minimizing the damage of the hits. The item on the right there is the second most famous item or second most desirable item probably in Diablo 2. It's Harlequin Crest. It's a hat which gives you lots of skills, lots of attributes, health and mana, but it also gives you 50% chance of getting better items. Like when enemies drop items in Diablo, it's random. They drop a random item. Some enemies drop better than items than others, but it's still random. This item makes it so that those random items come out at a higher level of quality than if you weren't wearing it. So if the feedback loop of grinding is always getting more power to kill things faster, instead of enhancing your killing power, it kind of enhances the enemy's dropping power. Same goal, you're after those really elite drops to show off to all your friends, but it just does it in a different way, a way that's essentially at right angles to the essential way. Now, I'm not going to get into the weeds. I know we just saw a graph, don't panic. I'd like to make a lot of graphs, but these graphs, which I'm showing you right here, they all make one point. And that point is that almost every stat or systemic stat in Diablo 2 operates on a diminishing returns curve. So if you try and accumulate a lot of stat points or benefits to your attack speed or your hit rate or your defense rate, after a while, those points start to become much less valuable. And the reason for that is that the designers want you systemically to try and do something orthogonal, to not try and do one stat, not just power your strength or your dexterity. They want you to find multiple different strategies for gaining power. They want you to do some attack speed, some attack rate, or the hit rate, some defense, some magic defense, etc. If you try and just do one stat, you're going to run into a kind of a brick wall of diminishing returns. So even within this super grindy game, you run into a problem that you're not supposed to play that way. You should be playing in an orthogonal way. You should use orthogonal solutions to our super grindy endgame.
It also provides the important motivation to start trading gear out for Magic Find gear. Because, right, so if you're only getting so much better at fighting because you've gone from fighting, at 850 quality to 870 quality, if you can trade down to 700, 650 and still reasonably get through the bosses fast enough, but you get to carry an extra 125% MF or something, your overall efficiency rating goes well up.
He still remembers all the eye levels. I'm really impressed.
You guys are very generous to designers. Sometimes we do things like that, I think, just because the math doesn't work if we don't.
Yeah, no.
It's literally math kills in these games. The orthogonal stuff, the here's a clever bit, they actually save us from being too reliant on math. If every level doubled your strength, the game would fall apart. It would just complete. So it's interesting that you guys looked at that as designers are smart and do this to encourage orthogonality. Well, and as a designer, I'm like, I do that because it's easier.
I was going to say, let me say this. Oftentimes, this is actually an emergent thing. It isn't necessarily intentional.
Absolutely.
We're talking about it in Diablo 2. As an emergent thing in a game, it was a very successful game. I guarantee you there are games for which ideas like this necessarily were attempted and didn't necessarily pan out. And because they weren't interesting and because they weren't compelling and because there were no reasons to play once you had beat the game on hardest difficulty, the games maybe necessarily didn't become as popular. And because these sorts of solutions didn't become evident at some point or because there was no alternate path to play the game, it doesn't get as much notice.
I will say I did interview Stig Hedlund, the spreadsheet jockey of Diablo 2, and he absolutely said that he definitely intended all of this.
Yeah, that's what we all say.
So the overall structure that's happening here, this is something I talked about earlier, but which becomes irrelevant again in Final Fantasy VII, is that as you get through a grindy game with lots of orthogonal solutions, the last third of the game is going to have the most number of orthogonal solutions because you have the most number of skills. You have different avenues to do different things. Like you can talk your way or fight your way. Because if in Fallout New Vegas, for example, there are enough skill points that you could do two things perfectly. So you get to be a great rifleman and a smooth talker, which can be a problem though, because if you kill everything at 500 yards, you don't get a chance to talk to it, which was my first experience of Fallout New Vegas. So I had to reload. But as you get to the back half or back third of a game, you really get a lot more options, and this is going to become really relevant in Final Fantasy VII. So many of you remember this game, the cool commercials. And if you fail, there's always the reset button. Is everyone too young here to remember that one?
I remember the commercials for 6 with the Moogle, but not 7.
Okay, all right. Well, maybe I don't want to saw that. I don't want to feel too much like a dinosaur. Now, Final Fantasy VII was a really easy game for those first 2/3, right? It's because the point of the game was to tell a story, and they accomplished whether you like it or not, they accomplished what they were out to do. But in the back third of the game, they have these optional bosses, Ruby Weapon and Emerald Weapon, who are super duper ultra hard, and you need to grind the heck out of your characters to beat them, or do you? Grinding. Yeah. So on the left, you see the first option, which is to just kill dark dragons until you're level 99, which takes about 20 hours. Yeah, I may have done that. Or you buy the strategy guide and know that you can race chocobos. A chocobo is a bird. It's like a mountable bird. It's like a cross between an ostrich and a golden retriever. And you can ride them, and you can race them, and you can breed them. And this only becomes available in the last third of the game when you have an airship to transport them, and you can rent some stalls for them and everything. We'll go into that in a sec. But that leads to is what I call the Chocobo Cycle. So at the end of Final Fantasy VII, when you reach the end of the game, you stop buying weapons. Shops stop carrying new weapons. You have to find them in dungeons, which is pretty orthodox for RPG design, especially JRPG design. You have to find your best weapons in dungeons. But that leaves you with a lot of extra money because all those enemies you killed, you don't have to spend that money you got from them. So you have all this extra money and you think to yourself, well, this is stupid. What do I use this on? Well, the designers actually have a reason for this, is that money is supposed to be invested in chocobos. You invest in chocobos, you house them, you feed them, you breed them, you race them, you spend a ton of money. It's like a rich man's hobby. It's like having a boat. And all that money turns into chocobos, and then when you race the chocobos, you can get rewards which are orthogonal and not really obtainable anywhere else. So the highest level racing rewards for chocobos are like items like elixirs, which are really just a really valuable item, or a materia, an item basically that allows you to gain more EXP. Right? That's a perfect example of the orthogonal solution. Is that you could, if instead of having to kill faster and faster, what if your EXP points just went up? What if, as this item got stronger, you just gained more EXP? Well, that would be a totally orthogonal solution to the problem of having to kill enemies faster and faster. But those elixirs also give you a second, so there's sort of a branch here. You can use the elixirs that are a common reward for chocobo racing to get, you basically throw them at an enemy, and the enemy just gives you EXP. Instead of having to kill the enemy, it's like, oh, thanks, that was great. Thanks for the Pepsi. Here's the most EXP you can possibly get in a game. And that's another orthogonal solution. Instead of combat, you heal an enemy with an item that you can only really get, unless you're duplicating items, but with an item that, unless you're cheating, you can only get from chocobo racing in large quantities. And so all that EXP and money then gives you a way to cycle back to you have more money and you can make more chocobos, and you can just repeat the cycle ad nauseum until you're level 99 and you have all the best stuff in the game. But this chocobo cycle takes 5 to 8 hours as opposed to 20 hours of killing dark dragons, and you're not doing the same thing the whole time. You're doing basically 3 different activities. So instead of just fighting one enemy over and over and over again, you do 3 different things, and those 3 different things actually give you combat power later in the game. So there's a feedback loop of orthogonal solution that involves all of the other elements in the game. It's just that a lot of people don't see it because it's tucked away at the end, because Final Fantasy VII is about telling a story. Now, that's actually the end. But
jump back to 7 real quick.
Yeah. I wanted to open up. I was going to say, I want to open up to these two to talk about other systems that are like this, which give you orthogonal solutions systemically, and then I want to open up to the crowd to talk about that too.
So I'm just jump real quick on 7, and then we'll go to other subjects. 7 not only provides you the ability to do that, it itself has multiple kind of paths and ways to build characters for combat itself. So obviously they come with their own limit breaks. They kind of thematically have stuff they do. But there are a couple little ways to game the system in certain ways. Enemy skill, for example. Ways that you can kind of, you have a different experience because now you're traveling around trying to get, like, if you can get beta early in the game, it completely changes what you can kill and when. You just have to very carefully deal with that sand serpent boss. Like,
it's an enemy skill. So enemy hits you with a skill and then you learn it. So that's what he's talking about.
Blue magic, if you're familiar with the series. So that becomes a path. Well, I'm going to try to build up that because there are some very powerful things in there, and that's going to expedite the process for me. So by the time I get to late game, it's not going to be as troubling. Or you can use the Chocobo system to go get, the hidden materia that becomes available if you can build up to the best Chocobo that allows you to go to a part in the game you can't get to otherwise. So there's lots of kind of different routes to power, which eventually get you to whatever your sense of completion for the game is, whether it's killing these optional bosses or maxing out whatever the numbers are, etc.
Yeah, you can just go to Call of Duty, right? You just finished Call of Duty, the last Call of Duty. You can shoot or you can sneak through things in many of the encounters. Right? That's like, it's a first-person shooter, and you can still get through 80% of one of the encounters without firing your gun. It's certainly possible in most games. Are there any indie tabletop role-playing gamers here?
Sort of.
Because what I find fascinating is there's like a revolution in indie tabletop role-playing games right now. And we are seeing some systems that encourage the players to create their own orthogonal solutions. DM-less systems where the DM rotates around the table. Systems where you can do anything you want as long as it sounds logical. Like, you can just say, okay, so I reach in my pocket and I take out my whip and I use it to get across the cavern. And everyone looks at you and says, where on your character class does it say you have a whip? And you go, well, it just makes sense because my character feels like the kind of person who would have a whip. And you look around the table and everyone goes, yeah, that seems reasonable. Go. Right?
So they're play with the people you're playing with.
Well, no, the games, these new sort of really small indie role-playing games are designed around the concept of who gets to be the person that says you can and can't do something, and who gets to be the person. It's like taking all the computer game stuff and saying that code that sets up the barrier for what you're allowed to do. we're going to give that to the tabletop player and say, you can do it yourself. You can decide, because it's about the story for so many people. You have a character that wants to try a wacky solution, you look around the table and go, yeah, it was a great story. That would not be a good story if you could do that, so no.
I've not seen it system driven, but I knew a group that once ran a Saturday morning cartoon style RPG. And the idea was everyone was playing really what they wanted to play, and you can imagine like old Saturday morning cartoons, the characters that were all meshed together in the places that were never made sense. It was just a complete hodgepodge of everything. But they would use a rotating puck for the, like, you're the GM this week, you're the GM this week, you're the GM this week. So the story was starring most but not all of the characters every week, and you would get slightly different perspectives and slightly different takes because everyone was kind of taking turns running things.
And you might know that one DM is more happier with certain types of solutions than another, and it's essentially changing over time.
The metagame.
Yeah. But for role-playing, I mean, there's just a huge difference between tabletop role-playing, which is about joint story creation, and JRPGs in particular, which is about experience the story I wrote for you until you're done. But I find it's a fascinating space, and if there's any indie role-playing game designers or who want to get into it, they're cheap, they're small, they're fast, they're amazing. They're really, really inventive thinking to encourage you to think differently and not be worried about it if the system lets you do it.
Cool. So just to structure the questions just a little bit, because they said we could run over, so we've got some time. I want to just first deal with questions that are more about like anything that in this presentation which was unclear or where you want to have clarification about. And then if we still have time, which I think we will, I'd love to go into some examples of, maybe obscure games that have really cool orthogonal solutions. But I just want to deal with things, maybe questions about clarity first. So please, by all means. I'm always so clear. No one ever needs to ask any questions. It's great.
Oh, I got you. Here. There you go.
Go.
Yeah, you absolutely can, or you can shout. I normally shout. Either way, whatever makes you feel comfortable.
Okay, so the discussion thus far has been about, so the objective of the game is fixed, but there are orthogonal solutions to solve that fixed problem. I was wondering if what your thoughts are. So like players might come into a game wanting different things. So like in each of these games, there's a final boss. There might be different ways to fight the final boss, right? But what if I don't want to fight the final boss? What if I want to be a master chef instead, right? So I was wondering what your thoughts are on having allowing orthogonality in, the player motivation space.
Goals, orthogonal goals.
Yeah, orthogonal goals.
I mean, my first thought is that that's the original form that they took, right? The Brownstein players all wanted some kind of different victory condition. So although some of them were nested within each other, they wanted different things, and so they chose different means. So that's super cool, and I think it's like a historical thing that kind of got truncated because computers?
Yeah.
Well, Minecraft.
Yeah, Minecraft is totally orthogonal goals, right? Elder Scrolls, yeah. And there's like you can go good, dark side, light side. Fallout 4, for all of its flaws, has orthogonal goals. You can choose any of the 4 factions. Or you can be like me and be completely unable to choose and paralyzed and have to stop the game. Yeah, because I wanted to make peace with all 4 of them, and that wasn't a possibility. So that's a shame. But yes, it's a fascinating thing that is rarely done.
There is one space that does this probably better than others right now, and it's not a place you'd expect it, but MMORPGs. So we often talk about you have either competitive games or cooperative games. But there is sort of a third category here. There's conjunctive gameplay. And this is the idea that no 2 people are necessarily logging in to do the same thing. You may want to be the best fisherman. You may want to be the best archaeologist. You may want to go into the dungeon and kill the boss with 24 of your buddies. You may want to sit in the auction house all day and make billions of gold and turn it into real-world currency by buying monthly tokens and selling them to people. Like
EVE Online is all that.
Right. Yeah. So there's
almost like real life. Jeez.
There are so many ways to play. Now, for any one of those particular paths, there still may be an optimal path to take to do it. A certain build, a certain character type. Like, I want to be the best gatherer, so I'm going to play the class that can fly and collect herbs while they're flying, and that maximizes my speed and blah blah blah. You can still theory craft that stuff out to a certain point. But at any given idea, when you log in, there is a bevy of options that you can consider your own personal end game. There's no specific route to success. That's all right. It's just a QA slide, whatever.
Yeah, so I want to say that for EVE Online, for anybody who's familiar with it, is a game that just, I don't know if you know this, when they started EVE Online, the early release, they actually had a story in mind. They had this plan for this alien invasion, and they assumed that all the players would get together and fight back the aliens, and it'd be a cool joint mission. And then they were broke; they didn't have the money, so they launched their game in a beta-ish format. And by the time they had the money to do the rest of the thing, they realized that was the dumbest thing they could do. Because the players created content for themselves, and it was way more interesting. And you can do lots of things in EVE Online.
It's also cheaper for the players to create their own content.
That's right. Yes. Yeah. And creates great stories, too.
Yeah,
great stories.
Has anyone read the book about the history of the wars of EVE Online?
Yeah.
That's crazy. That's just nuts.
Yeah. I did some work for EVE Online, just full disclosure, as a gatherer of data for them, and it was a fascinating learning experience, how committed they were to joint storytelling. But interestingly, they all felt like they had the same mission, much like a guild that might have different jobs. Like you're in your company, you're doing your thing. For those of you who don't know, EVE Online is a game with very few rules, a very real-world cash economy. They have a doctorate in economics on staff who writes an economic paper about how the economy of EVE Online is working. They have people who have created companies. Some space is dangerous, so they grouped together. They built a space station with years worth of work online to build a space station. No one person could do it. No one group could do it. So they formed a company. They sold shares in the company. When you get beat up in space, you go to that space station, you pay someone, it pays a dividend out to the company, pays a dividend out to the people who own shares. None of that was programmed in. None of that. It was all wide open.
The tens of thousands of real-world equivalent dollars of betrayals that have occurred in that game are just
epic.
Notorious but wonderful to read all at once. I think we had a question way in the back. Yeah.
Do you think it's desirable from a design standpoint to try to make all of the orthogonal solutions equally viable, or is it okay to have some that are just more difficult to succeed at than others?
I like a spectrum. I like New Vegas has a spectrum. Some things are more difficult than others, but you feel cool because you did it and you're not supposed to. Deus Ex also has a spectrum of orthogonal. There's there's the book. If you think of in terms of chess, like on book and off book. There's the on book orthogonal solutions where you talk your way out, and there's the off book ones where you use mines to climb the Statue of Liberty. Yeah, that happens. Anyone ever done that? You can blow yourself to the top of the first mission. It's pretty cool. That's an off book orthogonal solution, but it does work. So yeah, that's much more difficult though.
So collectible card games, just to jump into more of my experience, are essentially orthogonal by design in every way. And we use in that space, we want to make some decks harder to win by, because then it's more exciting and more challenging. And it can be used as a skills tester. I might be a much better Magic the Gathering player than you, so I want to play a fun game. I'm going to try to win this crazy way, and I'm going to let you try to win the normal way, but I'm a better player than you.
I'm a combo player, so I know what you're talking about.
Yeah. Now that game's getting a little more social, there's a lot more of that in the game. A lot more hard to win, but fun. And brag-worthy. I won with the Goblin Bomb.
Complaint about games, though, is that the direct intent, like the path that the developers intended, is often just far more successful than any other cool thing you could do.
Hearthstone.
So, Pokemon is a good example where it's like, just put your starter in the front of your party, never catch another Pokemon, win the game easily because you just over-leveled everything, and that's the easiest way to go through it. But all the interesting design elements are below the surface. So you feel like you're kind of undercutting yourself by picking a different path.
In my class I teach, we would call that broken. We say games have an intended, designer's intent, a way that they want players to experience the game, even if that way is lots of paths to victory. And if you don't explore that, that's our definition of broken.
Or you could do Hearthstone and force everyone to play Priest because it's totally up right now.
Yeah, and collectible card game designers are not as smart as you think. Just real quick, there's a lot of people who are like, oh, they designed that on purpose, so we'd all have to do this. No.
Most groups of gamers will eventually identify ideal paths.
Yeah.
There's too big a community space at this point, the ability to communicate amongst each other and develop shared resources for this stuff. I mean, GameFAQs alone has been doing that since the late 90s, and it's only gotten more communicative over time. So the ideal path is going to be found. The trick is whether that ideal path is itself challenging enough or entertaining enough to meet the requirements of the satisfaction of the design team. I know, for example, in our small group of people many years ago when we played Red Faction, the rail driver it's one thing to make a game with like 15 different guns, but when one gun can kill anybody in one hit, anywhere on their hitbox, can shoot through walls, can see through walls, reloads fairly quickly, and is not exactly hurting for ammo, why do the other 14 guns exist in this game? So you run into very quickly like, well, did they make that too powerful, or did they not perform enough scarcity on this device? There are games for which you have these incredibly overpowered things, but they themselves provide, interestingly, an orthogonal approach. My favorite first-person shooter example of this is if you've ever played Quake 3 or Unreal. I think Quake is probably a good example for this. Who here knows what quad damage is? All right, fair number of you. So quad damage does a couple of things remarkably well. The first thing it does is it announces its presence. You get that real intimidating wow, right? And you hear it somewhere. And you have directional audio, hopefully, so like maybe it was over there, and then you just hear wow because somebody got killed by somebody with quad damage, and it's a little bit closer and a little bit closer, and that fear for your life starts to brew. But it also changes the way the person with it is playing. They're immediately like, okay, now I gotta find as many people as I can, as quickly as I can, and kill them all. And your weapon of choice may change. You may have been using the railgun because it was a one-hit kill weapon. But why would I use the railgun? Now it's gonna do 400% health instead of 100% health. That no longer becomes a sensible decision. Maybe you switch to the grenade launcher, which you would normally do 30% health and is now doing 120% health damage, which is also now gonna be a one-hit kill because it has a nice big splash and I can bounce, pineapples around corners. Or maybe you switch to the machine gun because you're not the most precise shooter in the world, but the bullet's going from 3 damage per hit to 12 damage per hit. You can pretty much chew anybody down if you catch them around a corner. The choices you make and what makes sense for you in any given scenario is altered just because of this simple mathematical scale thing, not necessarily because in a large aggregate thing, higher number beats lower number, but because the decisions, the cost-benefit analysis you make with the power relative for each of those guns has suddenly changed because 4 times damage is a big enough jump that, oh, well, now I have to reconsider, like, this is too strong. We talked about it with trading your strength in Diablo 2 for Magic Find. Now you're essentially trading damage for area of effect. You're trading damage for precision. And, those decisions being made on the fly is really, really exciting. And the game not only communicates that to the person who has it, but it's communicating it to everybody else around them, which is changing the predator and prey equation amongst all people.
Yeah, and we say 1 + 1 = 10 when you're good at a game. When you know those things, 1 + 1 = 10. I have quad damage. Now I have also the grenade. 10. I have 10. Better than having just the other gun, which is 6. But that's sort of combo management. I still feel like that's not quite the really orthogonal stuff, like talking the boss monster out of something, which is
so awesome.
That is awesome.
Yeah. It's I guess as much as we have in a space that is restricted by the fact that we still have to teach a machine how to do this for the players.
Yeah, I mean, orthogonality exists like every other element of game design. It's not binary. It exists in a spectrum. Some things can be more or less orthogonal, and that's the Quake example is an example of orthogonal strength, right? They're an orthogonal modifier to strength, whereas talking the boss monster out of doing something is at the high end of orthogonality, and something else might be at the low end, like the diminishing return curves in Diablo 2. They're sort of in the middle. But this exists in a spectrum. It's not just a yes or no thing, and certain games need less orthogonality, like really competitive fighting games, for example. You can't have too much difference, or else your design is going to blow up. You have to have, there's only has to be a certain number of core skills that players are competing over, or else, because if you have some really weird character who can just use exploits to kill every other player in the game, then you have an orthogonal problem.
And it's not always good to have it in games. There are some games for which thinking outside the box isn't necessarily in the spirit of the game. Sports is something that kind of immediately comes to mind. It can be one thing to be like, yeah, we're going to play hockey, and we're going to have 2 goalies and 5 skaters on each side, and 2 minutes for this penalty and 5 minutes for this penalty. But we're just going to wedge somebody in the net who somehow has a 6-foot by 4-foot profile and can fit into the net, and it's not against the rules, and let's see you get a puck through him now.
Yeah, the great exploit. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So there are, in theory, we gate things when we feel they necessarily violate stuff, and I think sports and then esports, also by its nature, you're not necessarily looking for orthogonal solutions, you may be looking for people who can identify, we talked about the metagame, and figure out what the next path is and the thing that people aren't optimizing for and exploiting individual weaknesses or certain combinations of things. But they're intentionally closed-gated because it is a skills competition, right? What we're kind of discussing is the ability to expand and have a more creative exercise because we're really curious to see your problem-solving skills, not your game-playing skills. There's some Venn diagram overlap, but they're not really the same thing.
Yeah, track and field is the easiest example, right? Track and field, it's against the rules to punch someone you're running against, right?
Track and field and guns.
Yeah, track and field and guns. Except there is one of those. Anyway, so track and field, it's against the rules to punch somebody because the game was designed to skill test for speed, right? The 400-yard dash is designed to skill test for speed. It's designed specifically to do that and only to do that. Orthogonality is just not allowed. You get orthogonality, you get differences in training. Sometimes when it does enter those things, when someone has a new strategy that's not against the rules and it's too powerful, they just change the rules, right? They just change that. So as you get to be a more professional sport, when money's on the line, or even just more professional, you'll see very less orthogonality. And that's good. That means it's easier to watch. It's easier to know what's going on as a spectator. It's easier to know what I need to do to be that good. If you're a wide receiver on a football team, you probably should be tall. You should probably be fast. You should probably be able to jump. Right? These are well-defined things.
Sticky hands would help.
Yeah, knowing astrophysics, irrelevant. Right? You're never going to go, I'm leaning back on my skills of singing and songwriting, and here we go. It's just not the way to go.
Let's start in the back. Yeah, that's you.
Sorry. I was going to ask a question, maybe orthogonal to this. You guys are talking about orthogonality, and it seemed like kind of outside of combat. I'm kind of curious thinking about orthogonality sort of within combat, maybe like a grid-based system where, like, normally you're trying to reduce the character's health below 0 to kill them, and a grid-based system, if they just don't move, then you effectively kind of taken them out of combat.
Like a petrify.
Yeah, I'm kind of curious, like, what your thoughts are on orthogonality.
There's a whole YouTube genre of people pushing Dark Souls monsters off cliffs, right? It's like, fuck you, Mimic. I don't need to fight you. And you push them off a cliff, and that's the end of the monster. And then there's and then 420 XXX on the screen. And if you search the YouTube for it, it's great. It's people exploiting Dark Souls monsters. But yes, by using movement and not even fighting them, just blocking them off a cliff.
Yeah.
Really cool. I like that a lot.
High-level D&D is all about that. You have a skill list in high-level D&D that's just this long, right? And when you have your big final boss, like, okay, this is what I need you to do. I need you to slow him down. I need you to cast invisibility on me. I need you to do all these things as a highly coordinated thing, with each one trying to get 1 + 1 = 10 so they can kill the thing.
And sometimes it's by design, and for D&D it very much is because, as you know, for most of like the charts things, there's sort of a linear increase with certain thresholds for like your melee classes, but wizards just have this exponential curve where their potential goes off the charts, but they're still glass cannons, and a lot of what they can do is kind of change the rules of the encounter as it is going in such a way that it provides the other members of your group an ability to kind of overcome whatever challenge you're running into. Sometimes it's a matter of kind of exploiting mistakes designers made or intentional decisions designers made sometimes. I don't think I've ever found out the answer to this. It may be out there. Tell me if I'm wrong. You can throw a Phoenix down at the train in FF6. You miss out on suplexing it, which is awesome, but it also just insta-gives it because the train counts as undead, I suppose, and using a life spell on an undead kills it instantly. But is that intentional because it's a train carrying souls to the other side? So, like, is the train technically undead, or were all the enemies in there undead and they just forgot to flip it for that one particular, encounter? I don't know.
Well, you can do that for a lot of different enemies in Final Fantasy series. So
Sure.
I think maybe they screwed up one time and they're like, let's run with this. Let's make it a feature.
Yeah, it's a
If you do
feature,
it
not a
6
bug.
more times, no one will think that first one was a mistake.
Yeah, Charlie Parker, the great jazz saxophonist Charlie Parker once said, if you make a mistake while playing a jazz solo, do it 5 more times and everyone will think you meant it.
That's must not love jazz so much. Yeah, in front.
Yeah. Going back to sports a little bit, there's one sport I can think of that has a degree of orthogonality built in, chess boxing.
What?
Yeah, no, that is a thing.
Yeah.
I can't remember the amount of time between moves, but a standard boxing match is what, 2 minutes or 3 minutes?
3-minute rounds.
It's 3-minute rounds. Round of boxing, I don't know how many turns. Is it like
some amount of time of playing chess.
Right. I think it's like each person gets 3 30-second moves or something, right? And you go back and forth between the two.
Yeah, and so you can win either by checkmating your opponent when they're playing chess,
Or getting a
or
knockout.
like a TKO or
Right.
So someone invented a sport that was like, some nerd got picked on in high school and was like, one day I'm going to kick your ass.
Yes.
And he was like, I can turn this into a sport.
No, he's totally right. It's a
That's
thing.
awesome.
Yeah. That's amazing.
I'm going to have to look into that now because I was not aware there was a thing.
I do not think it's gotten Olympic approval yet.
Yeah.
Which is weird because I think each of the individual things has, or is chess not yet?
I wonder.
I
if
thought they were
Blackfoot's gonna be
arguing
good
for
again.
chess.
He's a hell of a boxer. He's a smart guy.
Yeah, there's
Right.
a lot of smart boxers.
Yeah, but I find it really interesting in that it's, by definition, an ortho game, and it has such strict orthogonality built into it.
Yeah. It's totally not 90 degrees, the 1-2 thing. So getting punched in the head would really hurt your ability to do chess, but I guess it's in there.
Yeah, just have your heart rate up. Yeah, two
Might-
ways to win that are very different, that are available to both players is really rare.
That's
Two ways to win that are different to different players, like multiple victory conditions for players.
Yeah, you'll see, I guess the more common version of this is like, oh, we'll have a series of challenges and each one is individually scored and weighed and that gets a thing and maybe whoever wins the majority of the thing. The idea that both of these completely different challenges have the single victory or failure attached to them is very interesting.
Yeah, what's that skiing shooting thing in the Olympics?
Biathlon.
Yeah, that's like skiing and shooting. That's
Yeah, downhill skiing followed by target shooting.
Yeah, that's two very different skills, but I don't think you can
It's
just.
the James Bond of
Finnish warfare.
You should have to parachute in. You should have to parachute in, ski, take off the suit, have the tux, drink a martini, and then shoot.
I mean, mounted archery is hard enough. How far are we going to go
Then you
with
should
this?
have to seduce someone, either gender.
Yeah.
Let's move up from the back. So yeah.
Kind of touching on what you were saying about orthogonality, I screwed that word up. Just
Welcome to the club.
on Combat itself, I've been thinking a lot as you talked about how you can kind of subdivide goals. So you talk a lot about kind of just getting through the game in different ways, but you could say that combat is one of the ways you can get through the game. And within combat, there's different ways you can complete that objective of killing the enemy.
Absolutely.
And games that have a large cast of characters, usually the way they try to diversify characters is by finding different ways to say, all right, you're going to beat the enemy. I was wondering if you had any suggestions on how that approach of kind of subdividing the goals could be used to help develop a more diverse cast of characters within a game.
Well, I mean, so if you think about it, and this is sort of a more theoretical answer, although I'll get to something else specific in a second. Orthogonality in RPG design is just a manifestation of Murphy's Law. If anything that can happen in a system that you've designed, someone's going to find a way to make that happen. And so you're going to have all these a system where you have if you have a melee and a ranged and a spellcaster, someone's got to find a way to use some skills from each to do something you didn't think was possible, like enchanting your rocket hammer or something. It's going to happen. And I think if you just throw the ingredients at somebody, they'll figure out a way. So you don't necessarily have to design for it as long as you have some wiggle room in the design. But on the other hand, I'm trying to think of there's in Final Fantasy VI, the Magimaster. You can beat him by draining his MP. It's really actually super tedious. But if you have really low health, like if you're doing a low level achievement run, you can do that. So you can just you equip everyone with MP draining activity or spells and weapons, and you just do that. But that's again, that's more just wiggle room in the system. That's not something I think they probably intended for. So I don't know. But you guys, please, if you want to.
Yeah, the other thing you have to factor in there is obviously in a lot of those systems, the things the characters can do are as much to solve the problem of fighting the enemies as to reinforce the characterization of the individuals in the storyline. Because again, the primary purpose of those games is to tell a story. So from a design perspective, you always have to be careful that whatever solutions you may be imparting into the constructive whole, you're not going to find all of them, but you should hope that they in some way, shape, or form generally fit with the idea of what you're trying to do. If you've written a story about you need to protect this individual and the rest of your party exists to protect individual one, and it turns out individual one, if you put two specific items on them, is an unbelievable tank, so you should put them in the front row and equip them with a shield and have them protect everyone else in combat, and then you get into a cutscene where everyone else is no, don't hurt this person, they're a soft little flower. It can throw everything for a bit of a loop. So you always want to kind of be cautious about that possibility. But generally speaking, the more open those things are, the more interesting the combat system
Measure
is.
your wiggle room.
Yeah, as a designer, I would say what I would do is I would design the cast of characters first, and then I would make a list of ways I don't want you to be able to win, and I make a list of ways that I do want you to be able to win. And that way, and the don't is super important, right? You don't want to make a game where you spend hours and hours making thousands of cool content bits, and there's a way to win without experiencing any of them, right? You do want to have a shared experience from a game. So start there, and then you can develop easy and say, okay, what's the way to this to win? Is my game working? No, it's not working, so make it work.
One more. I think we have time for
Yeah,
one more.
one more. Second row, please.
Yeah, so I'm not sure if I have the whole topic down right, but I think an example I came up on the fly was Animal Crossing, and how you really set your own goals in it, but if we're really getting down to it, the goal is to amass as many bells as possible.
I mean, if you, from Sart's perspective, the goal is to kill yourself, is to convince yourself that life is meaningless and you.
But the whole point is that you really can't do a whole lot in that game unless you amass a large amount of bells, especially if you're going to play a long time. And the game presents very meager ways like, oh, go sell fruit, go sell seashells. But then by the end of the game, you're realizing, oh wait, I can just wait to sell turnips every Sunday and amass millions in a single sitting. And there's all these different ways of accumulating bells, because that's the real metagame. Without these bells, you can't fund public works, you can't buy new furniture, you can't expand your house. So the real game of Animal Crossing, I feel like, is the bells, and I think it does a pretty decent job at giving you a lot of different ways of amassing these bells that you might not really realize until you put a lot of time in. And
Yeah, it's a good example of goal.
It's not an RPG, but it's also like, you don't need the bells because you set your own goals. Just kind of what your thoughts are on a type of game like that, where it's just a very confusing mess, I feel like.
Is it kind of an open worldy thing? Habbo Hotel, like what's important to me is what my house looks like.
No, it's just a regular simulation. It's very
It's sandboxy.
basic,
very sandbox. That's the term.
But it's
Yeah.
it's a small sandbox. It's a cute sandbox.
Yeah.
It's a small, cute sandbox.
And everyone is a perfect capitalist consumer in that game.
Yes.
And apparently, I should plant
me.
turnips.
Like nobody ever stops and thinks, well, what's the meaning of all this?
Stock market.
I want there to be an Animal Crossing where like there's like one of the people is a terrorist, and so you're halfway through like I've got 7 bells now I can open, then it's like boom, like and then everything is like everyone has to rethink their lives. Yeah, I mean, like that's a good example of like a paperclip which holds together all of the threads of orthogonal solutions because you want to have a common goal. But like I said, to the first question, sometimes some people might want to do orthogonal goals as well, but I think you can only choose one of those.
Yeah. And a lot of that is, again, you're pursuing an economic-based solution, and there's an ideal path, and it's, there's not too much obscurity about the goal. There may be different ways to go about doing it, but for a game that demands as much potential time to reach those sort of collectathon type things as it does, eventually, yeah, you do settle into some sort of ideal path pursuit, and that's where, going over to GameFAQs, if you're like, how do I get bells quicker, kind of comes in, right? It's not necessarily that the acquisition of those needs to be done for a specific purpose to get you to a certain way. That just gets us back to our original discussion on kind of an optimization route more than anything else.
Okay, great. I think we're going to lose the room here in a second.
Yep.
But I'm happy to. If anyone wants to come up and ask, that's fine.
Yeah, so I think we are good here. If you have additional questions for any of us, by all means, let us know out in the hallway. And thank you so much
Thanks for coming. Really
being out
appreciate
here.
it.
Thank you.